Hello, class. Welcome to a Teacher of History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me today. Did you know that the Portuguese were the first to turn to Africa to kidnap Africans and turn them into slaves in the mid-15th century? That most of the Africans that were purchased and shipped to the New World were actually caught and imprisoned by other Africans. That they had castles along the western coast of Africa to keep these prisoners in until they were sold onto a slave ship. And when they landed in the New World, often families were torn apart and these people lost their freedom forever. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will learn that and more in episode 21. The Middle Passage and Southern Society. Hello and welcome to class. To catch everyone up, I'd like to briefly provide context for our lesson today. Last week, we stepped away from our chronological survey of American history and spoke about the impact of slavery and involuntary servitude with regards to ideas of American independence. In our last lesson, episode 19, I gave a brief overview of the history of slavery. Hopefully, this laid some of the groundwork for what we will discuss today. Building off of episode 19, I think it is important to remind ourselves as we further discuss African slavery and the Middle Passage that slave labor will eventually become absolutely essential to creating the identity of the United States economy and its society. It is mind-boggling to consider the amount of wealth and manual labor that was brought to the Americas through the Atlantic slave trade. Now keep in mind, the Atlantic slave trade was a process that was mutually beneficial for the slave traders in Europe and the slave traders in Africa. The European powers who took part in this trade were able to provide labor for their colonies and in turn, wealth for the mother country. In addition, they were able to keep their laborers in their home country. This created new markets for these European powers and new sources and supplies of raw materials. Additionally, as I'll touch on later in this episode, the African slave traders received new technologies and wealth from Europe for these prisoners. The African slave trade began as far back as the mid-15th century when Henry the Navigator brought about a dozen Africans back from the west coast of Africa. In the 1450s, as the Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople, many of the Western European countries found themselves cut off from their supply of both sugar and human labor. These European countries began to look south towards Africa to supply their labor. By the late 15th century, the Portuguese dominated navigation and geography and were the first to get a foothold in the African slave trade. Remember in 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas, which we mentioned in one of our earliest episodes? I can't remember exactly which one, but it was maybe episode 1 or 3, something like that. Spain was given control over most of the North and South American continent, while Portugal was given everything to the east. Now, when looking at a map of the Western Hemisphere, we would see that the Portuguese only controlled part of present-day Brazil, and the Spanish got everything else. It seemed, at least, like the Portuguese got pretty screwed over, but what's important to keep in mind is that the treaty also gave the Portuguese control of the African coast. The Portuguese had been importing African slaves throughout the second half of the 15th century, and this slave labor was well known to be quite valuable. Eventually, the Spanish will ignore the stipulations of the Treaty of Tordesillas and become increasingly involved in this trade. Now, we know that the African slave trade became widespread from the 15th through the 19th century, but we have to consider the circumstances that allowed this to happen. Prior to the Europeans arriving along the African coast to participate in this trade, slavery was already quite common in the continent of Africa. See, much of the land in Africa was owned by the government. Therefore, kidnapped members of an enemy tribe that could be used as peasant farmers or even sold as slaves were quite literally the most valuable piece of property one could have. While from an outsider's perspective, it's easy to forget, we have to remember that many of these African tribes were enemies, no different than any other warring nations throughout history. Many are often shocked at the idea that Africans would imprison other Africans and sell them into slavery. Well, Europeans enslaved other Europeans throughout history, and we spoke at length about the forced indentures many were tricked into, which for all intents and purposes, in a lot of ways, was just another form of enslavement. So we shouldn't be that surprised. Just because people are the same race doesn't make them the same culture, or even mean that they remotely get along with each other or identify with each other. Throughout much of the 16th century, and you know what, I'm going to stop here. Just a real quick side note, something I haven't mentioned yet. The 16th century means the 1500s. I know it seemingly doesn't make sense, but think of it this way. If you're 15 years old, you are then currently living in your 16th year, because you've already lived 15 full years. So the 16th century is referring to anything after January 1st, 1500. Now, most of you probably knew that. Some of you may not have, but I get that question from my students every year when I teach history, so I figured I would bring it up now for you. If you didn't realize that, sorry for not mentioning it earlier. If you did, well, congratulations. Anyways, throughout much of the 16th century, that would be the 1500s, the Spanish and the Portuguese had participated in the slave trade, but their slaves lived and worked primarily on the islands off the coast of their mainland. So for the Spanish, it was the Canary Islands. For the Portuguese, it was the Madeira Islands. During this time in the late 16th century, the Spanish and Portuguese began to expand this African slavery experiment and shipped Africans to the New World. The New World had seemingly incredible potential. Things such as tobacco, rum, sugar, molasses, rice made these lands extremely valuable. In southern North America and in South America, especially in Brazil, an incredible amount of sugarcane was being grown and shipped back to Europe. Throughout much of the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the New World, African labor began to steadily replace native labor. Africans, for the most part, were better workers. Many of them had experience in manual labor. They had built up immunities to European diseases that the Native Americans, as we know, had not. And these crops, especially sugar, were so incredibly valuable that approximately 80% of all Africans shipped to the New World from the beginning of the slave trade all the way up until the American Civil War were shipped either to Brazil or the Caribbean. The introduction of the transatlantic slave trade and the role of the Europeans in this trade created a significant reliance on African labor and also undeniable racial prejudices. Just like the Native Americans, Europeans believed that they also needed to civilize Africans. With the Europeans involving themselves in the slave trade, the warring nations in Africa who had kidnapped the prisoners were then given the opportunity to trade for new technology, such as European weaponry. Of course, as you can imagine, this only further cemented the power structure in Africa when the guys in power then fell away their enemies to get weapons. They're going to continue to stay in power. What this does is it creates a vicious cycle of violence, capture, and enslavement. And with this, the African nations struggled to progress socially, really in any significant way, and it led to further crumbling of their cultural identity. The reality for these captured Africans was worse than we could imagine. Many of the African prisoners were chained or tied together with a rope to keep them from escaping, some of them even having devices tied around their neck. Depending on where and when they were captured, some were forced to march as far as 500 miles for over 6 months just to reach the African coast, where they would then be sold and shipped across the Atlantic. Mungo Park was a Scottish explorer who traveled to the central portion of the Niger River in the late 18th century and wrote an account of his travel and his experiences. On June 10, 1797, Park reached Pisania, a slave trading area, and wrote that, quote, "The slaves are commonly secured by putting the right leg of one and the left of another into the same pair of fetters. By supporting the fetters with string, they can walk very slowly. Every 4 slaves are likewise fastened together by the necks. They were led out in their fetters every morning to the shade of the tamarind tree, where they were encouraged to sing diverting songs to keep up their spirits. For although some of them sustained the hardships of their situation with amazing fortitude, the greater part were very much dejected, and would sit all day in a sort of sullen melancholy, with their eyes fixed upon the ground." Later, Park wrote about his conversation with the prisoners, mentioning how they believe their captors may in fact be cannibals, which actually was a pretty common African belief about white slave traders. Quote, "They were all very inquisitive, but they viewed me at first with looks of horror and repeatedly asked if my countrymen were cannibals. They were very desirous to know what became of the slaves after they had crossed the salt water. I told them that they were employed in cultivating the land, but they would not believe me, and one of them, putting his hand upon the ground, said with great simplicity, quote, 'Have you really got such ground as this to set your feet upon?' A deeply rooted idea that the whites purchase Negroes for the purpose of devouring them, or of selling them to others that they may be devoured hereafter, naturally makes the slaves contemplate a journey towards the coast with great terror, insomuch that the slaves are forced to keep them constantly in irons, and watch them very closely to prevent their escape." After the captives had reached the west coast of Africa, they were often imprisoned in slave castles. Dozens and dozens of these castles were built along the African coast, holding the captives until the slave traders arrived to either trade for or purchase the prisoners. Originally built in many areas by European powers to lay claim to the regions with large amounts of gold, right, and maintain power over these areas, the castles eventually became used primarily for the imprisonment of African captives. Many of these castles had poorly ventilated dungeons in which the prisoners were forced into, and they often had to stand for long periods of time, live amongst their own human waste. In addition, as I'm sure you can imagine, female captives had very little, if any, ability to resist physical or sexual assault. The prisoners could regularly be held for upwards of 3 months prior to being sold and placed on a slave ship set for the New World that could then take upwards of 3 months just to get to the Americas. So think about that. In theory, you could be an African captive who has marched upwards of 500 miles, will have to stay in a dungeon in a slave castle on the coast of Africa for upwards of 3 months just to get put onto a ship, to be squeezed into the hull to cross the Atlantic for another 3 months. So you could basically be captured for a full calendar year before you even get to America and are sold officially into slavery for the rest of your life. Tomás de Mercado wrote a book whose title is translated into the Manual of Deals and Contracts in 1587, said the following about the capture of Africans, quote, "It is public opinion and knowledge that no end of deception is practiced and 1,000 acts of robbery and violence are committed in the course of bartering and carrying off Negroes from their country and bringing them to the Indies and to Spain. Since the Portuguese and Spaniards pay so much for a Negro, they go out to hunt one another with the pretext of war, as if they were deer, even the very Ethiopians, who are different, being induced to do so by the profit derived. They make war on one another, their gain being the capture of their own people, and they go after one another in the forest where they usually hunt. In this way, and contrary to all justice, a very great number of prisoners are taken, and no one is horrified that these people are ill-treating and felling one another because they are considered uncivilized and savage. In addition to the pretext of parents felling their children as a last resort, there is the bestial practice of felling them without any necessity to do so, and very often through anger or passion, for some displeasure or disrespect they must have shown them. The wretched children are taken to the marketplace for sale, and if the traffic in Negroes is so great, there are Portuguese, or even Negroes themselves, ready everywhere to buy them. There are also among them traders in this bestial and brutal business, who set boundaries in the interior for the natives and carry them off for sale at a higher price on the coast of the islands. I have seen many acquired this way. Apart from these acts of injustice and robberies committed among themselves, there are thousands of other forms of deception practiced in those parts by the Spaniards to trick and carry off the Negroes finally as newly imported slaves, which they are in fact to the ports, with few bonnets, beads, and bits of paper under which they give them. They put them aboard the ships under false pretenses, hoist anchor, set sail, and make off towards the high seas with their booty. The shipment of slaves across the Atlantic is known as the Middle Passage, and we'll talk in more detail about the Middle Passage in just a minute. Hey everyone, thanks so much for checking out the podcast today. We here at A Teacher of History really appreciate it. If you're able to leave a rating or review on iTunes or Stitcher, that would be awesome. If you want to reach out, chris@ateacherofhistory.com, or find us on Facebook or Twitter. One last note, I know we have quite a few listeners in the Boston area, and Zach, Bill, and I this weekend are actually heading up to Boston to do some preliminary research for our episodes regarding the Revolutionary War and the pre-Revolutionary War period, and we're really excited about it. We might even catch a Yankees-Red Sox game too. If you live in the Boston area and want to meet up, grab a beer or a coffee, let us know. Or if you have recommendations for us on what we need to see and what we need to do, that would be awesome too. You can find me, like I said, on Twitter or Facebook, or at chris@ateacherofhistory.com. All right, let's get back to the Middle Passage. The shipment of slaves across the Atlantic is known as the Middle Passage. This was, for all intents and purposes, the transition of the African prisoner from just that, a prisoner, to a piece of property. Once aboard the African slave ship, there is no turning back. The die had been cast, and these people's lives were changed officially forever. In The History of Slavery and the Slave Trade, Ancient and Modern, numerous accounts of experiences aboard the slave ships give chilling detail to the everyday life of these African captives. The eyewitness accounts of this treatment are both chilling and extremely saddening. When researching for this episode, I read accounts of African prisoners crying throughout the night, missing their home and missing their family, with some so inconsolable at this state of affairs that they threw themselves overboard, committing suicide. There were some of the ships actually had nets on the side of them to catch African captives who were trying to throw themselves overboard to commit suicide, to keep them from killing themselves. The men and women were often chained down on the ship with little room to move, being imprisoned in the dark, hot, filthy hull of the ship, forced to live, sleep, and breathe amongst their own human waste. I'd like to read part of Chapter 10 of The History of Slavery and the Slave Trade, Ancient and Modern. It'll take a few minutes, but I think it just has some really interesting accounts of the African captives aboard these slave ships. Here we go. Quote, "On the subject of the stowage and its consequences, Dr. Trotter says that the slaves in the passage are so crowded below that it is impossible to walk through them without treading on them. Those who are out of irons are locked spoon ways to one another. It is the first mate's duty to see them stowed in this way every morning. Those who do not quickly get into their places are compelled by a cat of 9 tails. And just as a quick side note, a cat of 9 tails is like a whip with 9 different strands on it, and it hurts a lot. When the scuttles are obliged to be shut, the gratings are not sufficient for airing the rooms. He never himself could breathe freely unless immediately under the hatchway. He has seen the slaves drawing their breath with all those laborious and anxious efforts for life, which are observed in expiring animals, subjected by experiment to foul air, or in the exhausted receive of an air pump. He has also seen them, when the tarpaulins have inadvertently been thrown over the gratings, attempting to heave them up, crying out in their own language, "We are dying." On removing the tarpaulins and gratings, they will fly to the hatchway with all the signs of terror and dread of suffocation. Many of them he has seen in this dying state, but some have recovered by being brought hither on the deck. Others were irrecoverably lost by suffocation, having had no previous signs of indisposition. Mr. Falconbridge also states on this head that when employed in stowing the slaves, he made the most of the room and wedged them in. They had not so much room as a man in his coffin, either in length or breadth. It was impossible for them to turn or shift with any degree of ease. He has often occasion to go from one side of the rooms to the other, in which case he always took off his shoes, but could not avoid pinching them. He has the marks on his feet where they bit and scratched him. In every voyage, when the ship was full, they complained of here and want of air. Confinement in this situation was so injurious that he has known them to go down apparently in good health at night and found dead in the morning. On his last voyage, he opened a stout man who so died. He found the contents of the thorax and abdomen healthy, and therefore concludes he died of suffocation in the night. He was never among them for 10 minutes below together, but his shirt was as wet as if dipped in water. He has known several slaves on board refuse sustenance with design to starve themselves. Compulsion was used in every ship he was in to make them take their food. He has known also many instances of their refusing to take medicines when sick because they wished to die. A woman on board the Alexander was dejected from the moment she came on board and refused both food and medicine. Being asked by the interpreter what she wanted, she replied, "Nothing but to die." And she did die. Many other slaves express the same wish. The last source I would like to mention is a passage from the life of Oloda Equiano, who was an African who was kidnapped and shipped aboard a slave ship. And Equiano has some really valuable insight into his experiences, but I wanted to read you a section of his writings on the African slave trade when he landed in the New World. Quote, "We were conducted immediately to the merchant's yard, where we were all pent up together like so many sheep in a fold, without regard to sex or age. We were not many days in the merchant's custody before we were sold after their usual manner, which is this: on a signal given, as the beat of a drum, the buyers rush at once into the yard where the slaves are confined, and make choice of that parcel they like best. The noise and clamor with which this is attended, and the eagerness visible in the countenances of the buyers, serve not a little to increase the apprehension of terrified Africans, who may well be supposed to consider them as ministers of that destruction to which they think themselves devoted. In this manner, without scruple, are relations and friends separated, most of them never to see each other again. I remember in the vessel in which I was brought over, in the men's apartment, there were several brothers who, in the sale, were sold in different lots, and it was very moving on this occasion to see and hear their cries at parting. O ye nominal Christians, might not an African ask you, learned you this from your God, who says unto you, do unto all men as you would men should do unto you? Is it not enough that we are torn from our country and friends to toil for your luxury and lust of gain? Must every tender feeling be likewise sacrificed to your avarice? Are the dearest friends and relations, now rendered more dear by their separation from their kindred, still to be parted from each other, and thus prevented from sharing the gloom of slavery with the small comfort of being together and mingling their sufferings and sorrows? Why are parents to lose their children, brothers their sisters, or husbands their wives? Surely this is a new refinement in cruelty, which, while it has no advantage to atone for it, thus aggravates distress and adds fresh horrors even to the wretchedness of slavery. The trip to the New World took as long as 2 to 3 months in the 1500s, with the trip lasting closer to a month by the 1800s. Much of the mortality on these trips came from disease and dehydration, with an average of about a 15% death rate. While the Spanish and Portuguese dominated the early parts of the slave trade, the 17th century saw both the Dutch and the English become involved. The raw materials and crops, primarily sugarcane, allowed the West Indies to become the most profitable area in the New World. While the West Indies, which are the islands in the Caribbean Sea, by the way, focused primarily on sugar, the mid-Atlantic region of Maryland and Virginia focused on tobacco. South Carolina and Georgia relied on rice production. The labor involved to grow these various crops took a toll on the African slaves, especially those who were growing rice and sugarcane, which made some of the southern colonies even more married to the idea of the slave trade. The emergence of these large-scale cash crops created an incredibly wealthy group of families in the South and cemented a cash crop society in the South. Because of its reliance on slave labor and agriculture, the South did not industrialize as quickly as the northern half of the United States and will become increasingly reliant on slave labor. Discussions of ending the slave trade or emancipating the slaves was consistently met with immediate resistance from Southern representatives, knowing that this would cripple the Southern economy and their way of life. These are topics that we'll cover, of course, in much more detail in future episodes. As you pack up your things, I'd like you to think about the impact that the African slave trade has had on the United States of America. Black slavery is integral to America's identity. As we discussed last episode, the contradiction of a free society that was built primarily off of slave labor is a shocking contradiction that really can't be ignored. And if you notice, I'm making sure we're not ignoring it. The enslavement of a large majority of an entire race in the Americas for over 2 centuries is going to lead not only to palpable racial prejudice in many areas, but also will lead to constant political debate over the status of Africans in the United States, of course culminating with the American Civil War. But one thing we will discuss as we learn more about American history is that while African slaves were legally free during the 1860s, their uphill climb to social equality took a lot longer than that. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. All right, next week we are going to shift from slavery back to the colonies and back to the economies of the colonies. We'll talk about mercantilism and the triangle trade, and we'll also dive into the constant fighting between the English and the French in the 1700s. It's going to eventually set us up for our first major conflict in the colonies, the 7 Years' War, also known in America as the French and Indian War. See you next week.